Set 14 is live, and TFTflow.com has been updated for the launch patch. Any changes that are made after the recording of this video will get updated on the website, so make sure you're checking out the website for the latest information. The main changes for the launch patch are that number one, Brand and Ziggs are a lot more powerful, so Strategist Ziggs and Vertical Street Demon are both compositions that premiere those two particular carries, and I honestly believe they're probably the best boards that currently exist. You still have Strategist A.M.P that is doing quite well, which focuses on Annie plus Samira. Even after the nerf that they made to Samira's A.M.P scaling, that comp is still doing relatively well. We have Vertical Anima Squad that's doing well after some buffs to 5 and 7 Anima Squad. Vayne got nerfed with the Runon's Hurricane nerf. Vanguard's got nerfed with 6 Vanguard and Xayah getting a slight AD nerf. Jhin Nitro got nerfed with both a 10 mana nerf for Jhin as well as a Nitro scaling nerf for the traits. And then Bastion Zeri has gotten nerfed a couple of times because of the nerf to Gunblade as well as Zeri herself. And then 5 Syndicate actually got nerfed as well for Twisted Fate. So they made a couple of changes. Lastly here, Zed also got a 5 AD nerf. So they made some pretty big sweeping changes for the A patch that have made it so that effectively Strategist and Vertical Anima Squad are your strongest default lines. When it comes to hero augments, Jax, Kayn, or Rhaast and Vi are your playable options, with Rhaast probably being the best of those, and then Vi, and then Jax. When it comes to artifacts, the main thing I want to point out is that there are a lot of artifacts for Fiddlesticks Reroll. Namely, you have Anima Visage, you have Blighting Jewel on Fiddlesticks, you have Innervating Locket to a lesser extent on Cho'Gath, Sniper's Focus on Fiddlesticks is quite good, and then Talisman of Ascension on Cho'Gath. We have a couple of different artifacts for Twisted Fate Reroll, so that's Zanya's Silvermere Dawn on Darius, as well as Innervating Locket on Darius is quite good. We have a couple of different artifacts for the Strategist board with Mana Zane. We have some artifacts for Techie Reroll with Ludens and Mana Zane. So all of those different options are available here under the artifact tab on the website. When it comes to emblems, I want to note with Anima Squad and Street Demon that if you're just taking these emblems to play 7 Anima or 7 Street Demon, they're not going to be as powerful as some other options that are available when it comes to your augments, especially now that they have the new system with circlets. So generally speaking, on 3-2 and 4-2, you should not be angling towards an Anima Squad emblem or a Street Demon emblem unless you think you can get to the second emblem, which will enable you to hit 10 Anima Squad or 10 Street Demon. So most of the power of the emblem comes from the fact that you have the possibility of hitting 10 Anima or 10 Street Demon. We also have Bruiser emblem into Fiddlesticks Reroll. This might be S tier. I don't have it in S tier right now because I think it's kind of a noob Punisher, and when nobody really understands the set, I think this is going to be a little bit more powerful. We'll see how powerful it is after we see people a little bit more familiar with how to play this launch patch. Divinicorp into Divinicorp Zed is quite good. We have Strategist emblem into any of the different Strategist lines is quite good. And then finally, Syndicate emblem into Twisted Fate Reroll can be quite good. When it comes to resources, Siphoner Opener is completely broken. That's mainly because there are some really powerful cash outs and you're guaranteed to get those cash outs at the different round intervals. So you can cash out into Bastion Zeri, where you're looking to play around Draven and Zed. You can look to cash out into Divinicorp Zed. I think this is actually the better option right now, where you're using the crossover between Cypher units and Divinicorp units. And then the last option that you have is you can actually cash out into Strategist, because it can use a lot of items and a lot of gold, but then you would drop out of Cypher. So that would be a case where you would actually transition out of the trait, whereas these two particular options, you can stay in the trait. When it comes to augments, too much value into Twisted Fate Reroll is good. Vayne Reroll is good. Both of these comps you can play for 2 cost. 10,000 IQ is quite good because it gives you both gold and items, and the Strategist comp need both of those things very much. Quality over quantity is also good into the Strategist lines because, again, you have so many different high quality units that you can itemize. So by only having to put 1 item on each of those units and maybe 3 items on a select carry, you're able to itemize everyone, which is very impactful. Category 5 into Vayne Reroll is very powerful. There is a reason why they had to nerf Category 5, or rather, they had to nerf Runon's Hurricane. It's because Vayne was just so powerful with this particular augment. Spare parts, this was really powerful, but then they made a bunch of nerfs to Nitro, so this may not be as good as it was before. Double Trouble into Executioner Reroll is pretty good, and then you have Starry Night and Prismatic Ticket into your reroll compositions with Jhin Nitro as well as Techie Reroll. And that's mainly it when it comes to how to play the patch. All right, the first comp I want to talk about is Strategist Ziggs. I think this comp is underrated. I think most people that are looking to play AP lean towards playing around the Annie strategist board rather than the brand strategist board. But I think after the nerfs that they made to Samira's A.M.P scaling on her ability, as well as the buffs that they made to brand, I think this board is just as good, if not better, than the Annie board. A couple of things of note here. First of all, there are many replacements that you can make for these different 5 costs. You'll notice that the max cap board here has 4 different 5 costs. That can be quite difficult to get to. So if you look at this level 8 no legendaries board, we're replacing Samira with a LeBlanc, so we get 5 strategists. We're replacing Kabuko with Poppy, and then we're replacing Viego with Shyvana, and then eventually we'll upgrade into those 5 costs. The other thing of note here is that for the max cap board, we're actually only playing 4 strategists, which means that the strategist emblem is quite good. Not only because it gets us from 4 to 5 strategists for free, but also because the item itself is quite good, and we struggle to itemize all of the champions on this particular board. You'll notice that we want to have an itemized frontline tank, we want itemized brand, we want itemized Ziggs, we want itemized Samira. Ideally, we're also able to get itemized Viego. So by getting that strategist emblem, that's an extra item for our Samira or Viego, and that makes it easier to itemize the other units on your board. Another thing here that's worth noting is that brand wants your primary AP carry items, so you'll notice that he has the Guard Breaker and Jeweled Gauntlet, and then Ziggs is looking for your utility-based items. The last thing I want to note is that Garen is very powerful for this comp because he can farm the Strategist trait mod, which is effectively a 4th item almost for your brand, Samira, and Viego. So first you would obviously want to put this onto brand, and then you can put it onto Viego or Samira depending on which one you have itemized. I believe Samira is a little bit more powerful, but both of them are quite strong, and that is how you reach the max cap. Generally speaking, this is one of the best comps in the game for being able to win. All right, the next composition I want to talk about is Vertical Street Demon. This one is very similar to the comp I just talked about before with Strategist Ziggs. The only difference between these two is that Strategist Ziggs is looking to play around a bunch of high quality 5 cost units, whereas the Street Demon board is just going vertical into the Street Demon trait. So why would you want to do that? The main reason is if you had a really good Street Demon opener, and it's also worth noting that this is obviously a lot less expensive to play around these lower cost units like Mundo or Zyra or Rengar. So just want to note that this is mainly if you don't have the resources to play the higher cap board that we showed earlier, or the other possibility is that you have a Street Demon emblem, because there are 8 Street Demon units and you have a 10 trait. So if you have 2 emblems and you're able to reach level 10, or if you're able to reach level 9 with a dummy, then you are able to get 10 Street Demon online, and that is an insta win unless somebody else has something broken like 10 Anima squad. The max cap here with the Street Demon emblem is to drop out of one of the low quality units and play Garen, and then you want to farm a strategist mod for your brand and Samira, and then Street Demon mod for your Ziggs or Garen. And then if you have a strategist emblem, you can just play the same exact board that we had before. You're just now going to have a strategist emblem for your Samira, which makes it easier for you to itemize all of your units in the backline with Samira, Ziggs, and brand. Otherwise, this comp is practically played the exact same way as the strategist Ziggs board. We're just playing Street Demon instead of those high quality 5 cost. All right, next up we have Strategist A.M.P. We've talked about this board a couple of times. The big change that they've made over the last week is that finally it is no longer correct to play Nefiri plus Nidalee over higher quality units after some nerfs that they've made to the A.M.P scaling specifically on Samira, and I believe Annie as well. So now you actually are looking to play around this max cap board that drops out of those 2 A.M.P units for Kabuko plus Mordekaiser. Of course, you can also choose to play around Garen or Zac as well instead of this Mordekaiser here, but Mordekaiser is pretty efficient because he gives Bruiser for your Kabuko, as well as Techie for Viego, which is quite impactful. And the big thing of note is that Annie is somewhat of a perfect item hungry unit. You really want to have the double mana or triple really casting focused build if possible. And then now, unlike before, you can actually consider itemizing Ziggs because after the buff, he is quite good. All right, the next S tier default composition I want to talk about is Vertical Anima Squad. So you can play this with no conditions, and it's quite good. You don't need to have an Anima Squad emblem or anything else. And that's because of a buff that they made before the set went live. For both 5 Anima and 7 Anima, they buffed the amount of armor and MR for those breakpoints, as well as the amount of damage amp. When it comes to picking weapons, you want to make sure that you are picking weapons based on what you have Sunder or Shred for. So that is your reduction of armor or reduction of magic resistance effects. You just pick weapons based on what you have a more consistent version of for that. And then when it comes to Xayah itemization here, you're looking for either a full crit based build or you can go for a Shojin build with crit. The big thing of note is that this is itemized the exact same way as set 11 Kai'Sa was if you played set 11. If you haven't, don't worry. The main idea is you either go crit based or you go Shojin with IE and some other crit based item like Last Whisper or Guard Breaker. And then for Aurora, we're looking for utility based items mainly. So that would be your Morello and then Shiv, and then any AP items that you can throw onto her. You have really straightforward item holders for these higher cost units. So you could play Vayne for Xayah in the early game, and then you can play Yuumi for Aurora in the early game. If you get the emblem, there's a couple of different ways to play it. So the first way is playing around 4 Vanguard with Aphelios in the backline. Generally speaking, I would consider this to be on the weaker side of things. So you have this Strategist line that also plays around Samira. The main issue with this, of course, is you're now contesting all of the other AP carries that are looking for these particular units. So another option here is you can look to play around these high quality 5-cost units on your board. But the big thing of note is that Anima Squad emblem is mainly there for trying to get to 10 Anima. If you're just playing it in order to get to 7 Anima more efficiently by dropping out of a low quality unit, it's not as powerful as some other augment options that you have available for you. So there's a couple of different ways you can look to play this. Anima Squad is doing quite well right now, and you should probably lean towards it in any games where you have a decent Anima Squad opener. All right, next up we have Dynamo Misfortune. I think this has gotten figured out a little bit more than it was when I covered it last week. So we're playing 4 Vanguard, and we're looking to play Misfortune in the backline with ideally 3 damage items. You can play Shojin, which guarantees that you get to that second cast, but eventually you're going to have enough frontline that you'll be able to get to that second cast even with 3 damage items, and then it's just strictly better to have 3 damage. The other thing of note is that with Aurora, you're looking to build ideally utility-based items so that you're anti-heal and shred. And then you're looking to throw in a high quality, ideally 2-star unit from your bench. And then there's a bunch of different options for how to play around emblems. First, let's talk about the 5 Syndicate board. I don't think this is very good. You really kind of need to have an emblem to make this work. So let's talk about the Syndicate emblem. If you have a Syndicate emblem, you can choose to play something like Gragas here. You can choose to play something like Kobako. You could play Zac in this slot, but you're mainly just looking to find ways to make your front line a little bit better. And then you're shifting items over to Braum because you now have that second Syndicate effect on him. I would only really consider this if you were going for Braum 3. Then we have the Dynamo emblem. So there's a lot of different options here. A Dynamo emblem on Kabuko can be quite good, can actually get him to a second cast possibly if you have some tank items on him. There's also this option here where you get Ziggs onto your board. We also have this option which plays around 5 Syndicate. And then finally we have a Divinicorp board that you can look to play around that I've actually seen do reasonably well in the stats, but I haven't seen anybody play it yet, where you have Dynamo emblem on your Vex. And I could see the potential here where it could be quite good. But again, I have not seen this played yet. So a couple different options here for how to play around Misfortune. I think this is still getting optimized, but it is slowly getting figured out. And I think it is actually quite a good composition to play around. All right, next up we have Vayne Reroll. This is the composition that was responsible for Runon's Hurricane getting nerfed, something that I feel like very few people ever expected to happen. But yes, unfortunately, Runon's Hurricane had to get nerfed as a result of this composition because it synergizes so well with both Vayne and Senna. So that is worth noting that it is worse than it was before, but it's still doing really well right now. That might be something that kind of falls back a little bit when we see more people figure out how to play the patch, and maybe this comp gets a little bit weaker, but I still think it's going to be a solid option. I still think it's A tier. I just don't think it's S tier like the stats might suggest. And you're still looking to build Vayne the exact same way. So that's double Rageblade plus Runons. And then the Radiant Runons is still the best item you can get onto Vayne. You still have some other builds, but mainly you're still looking to play around with Runons here. And then if you are able to get something like Too Much Value here, you can see on the right side here, it mentions that you could play around Rhaast. You could play around Skarner as another Vanguard. You could play around Olawi that will give you Anima Squad, and then finally Vayne. And then eventually you would want to transition into a board like this. But for the mid game, you can choose to play 4 2-cost units in order to get as many rerolls as possible. There's 2 variations to this. You can play around 6 Vanguard here and then level up for Senna. And then eventually when you get to level 9, you're looking to play around 6 Vanguard plus 4 Slayer. And that's it for Vayne Reroll. All right, next up we have Vanguard Marksman. This is a composition that got hit by the Xayah AD nerf as well as the nerf to 6 Vanguard in terms of the amount of durability while shielding. I think it's kind of unfortunate because I don't even think this comp was that broken, and now I think it's kind of down in like mid to low A tier is where I would place it currently. I think the 4 Marksman 4 Vanguard version is definitely better than the 6 Vanguard version after the changes that they made after the nerf to 6 Vanguard. Which is fine. I mean, I think it was previously really well balanced between the two of them, where you would just pick whichever one you had a better spot for. Now I think the 4 Marksman version is definitely better because you can supplement your front line with Aurora, but 6 Vanguard still looks reasonably strong in the stats, so you can still play around 6 Vanguard and should definitely be mindful of it in case they make any changes moving into the future. But this comp is still the same as it was since the first day of PvE, which is that you're looking to play around Xayah plus Aphelios. They both share the same Marksman trait in the backline. Again, we haven't seen this a whole lot in the past where 2 different 4 costs share the same carry trait. So you are looking to itemize Aphelios with attack speed based items. One thing I do want to note in my last video is I mentioned that Wit's End was quite good on Aphelios. That was due to a bug. They fixed the bug and now Wit's End is okay on Aphelios, but it's definitely not anything special, not something you're going to angle towards anymore. And then Xayah is looking for, again, those Kai'Sa, set 11 Kai'Sa type items where you're looking for a full crit base build, or you can go for the Shojin build if you want to. All of it works, so a couple of different options are mentioned here, and that's mainly it for Vanguard Marksman. All right, next up we have Jhin Nitro Reroll. We're just going to focus on this version of Nitro Reroll because I believe that the Cyberboss and A.M.P versions are not good right now. So we're just going to focus on this one. And this one's centered around itemizing Jhin as well as Kindred in the backline, and then you use Shyvana as your primary tank. I think the main reason you would want to angle towards this line is either A, of course, you have a lot of really good early game items, especially if you have something like a pulse stabilizer for your Jhin as your first exotech item. And the other condition is if you have a really good reroll augment like Prismatic Ticket or Starry Night, because being able to hit your Nitro units sooner and get more chrome for farming your T Hex as powerful as possible, I think is really important. So they did nerf this line pretty heavily. They nerfed the Nitro scaling and they nerfed Jhin as well. I still think it's viable. It still looks reasonable in the stats. Again, this is another one of those compositions that will look better at the very start of a set when people don't really know what they're doing, because reroll compositions are pretty solidified and people know how to play those. They can't make mistakes with those as easily. But I think we're going to find that the nerfs that they made definitely make it so that this is not as good as some of the other lines, such as the strategist lines that I've talked about earlier in this particular video. So really, I would only angle towards this if you had a good reroll augment that enabled you to hit your 3 stars a little bit earlier so that you can farm as much chrome as possible. All right, real quick before we move on to the next composition, I have 2 quick announcements to make. Number 1, there's an official Discord server for TFT Flow now. You can join it by clicking this link in the upper right on the website. This is a great place to talk about the website and TFT more generally. And now TFT Flow has an official Patreon page. So if you want to support the website because you enjoy using it, this is a great way to directly do so. And there's a button here that anybody can click that will disable ads across the entire website. Just a small perk for those of you who decide to watch through, I guess, this sponsored section, if you want to call it. Back to the video. Oh, Bastion Zeri, Bastion Zeri. This is a comp that has gotten nerfed so many different times on so many different levels. I mean, they nerfed Gunblade, they nerfed Zeri, they nerfed 6 Bastion, they nerfed almost every part of this composition. The only part of it they actually buffed was the Exotech part of it, and then the Cypher portion is still doing relatively well. So those are the 2 conditions under which you need to understand playing it. First of all, you need to really only angle this line if you have a good Exotech item for Zeri, so that would be Flux Capacitor or Pulse Stabilizer. If one of those 2 items is not the first Exotech item, generally speaking, I would not angle towards this line unless you have a early game Cypher that you can do a big cash out by 3-7, 4-3, or 4-7, and then you can angle towards this variation here that doesn't play around 6 Bastion and instead plays around 3 Cypher, 4 Bastion, and a bunch of high quality units. Especially if you're able to hit this 3-star Draven, that can be quite powerful. But outside of that, generally speaking, this line is not as powerful as it was before, and you should not be angling this every game. In fact, I might even lower this to B tier because it really is somewhat conditional on, number 1, having a good Exotech item as your first Exotech item, and then number 2, usually you want to play this if you have an early game Cypher, and there is a better option for Cypher, which we'll talk about in a moment. All right, next up we have Divinicorp Zed. This is kind of the premier Fast 8 melee-based composition that exists, and it was not around last week when I made my comp guide because it was discovered right around that time, and it's done really well ever since then. In fact, it is the reason why Zed got nerfed by 5 AD before the set went live, and this comp is still doing reasonably well. So a couple of things of note here. The basic concept, really simple to understand. We're going vertical in Divinicorp units, and then we're splashing a couple of non-Divinicorp units, those units being Zed, Garen, and Urgot. With Garen, we're hoping to be able to farm a Divinicorp trait mod to put onto the Zed so that we can have 3 full real items on the Zed instead of, for example, having an emblem on the Zed, which you can see here in the alt builds. So we really want to have 3 proper items on Zed, and then we're really trying to get these 4 units fully itemized: Renekton, Zed, Vex, and Senna, and that's your max cap. And eventually, most of the time, this is going to be able to top 2 if you get into a spot like this one, where you have all of those different units itemized and upgraded. It's also a really good Cypher cash out target because there's crossover between the Cypher units, Vi and Galio, with the Divinicorp units with Rhaast and Renekton. So you're basically able to get Cypher online completely for free. And then it's the same exact concept again, where we're trying to get that Divinicorp mod onto the Zed. We now have the additional stats from Cypher, and you also have the additional resources from Cypher, which would make it easier for you to fully itemize your Renekton, Zed, Vex, and Senna. So currently, I think this is the best Cypher cash out target other than maybe Strategist, but this is the best one that actually keeps Cypher on the board over Bastion Zeri, in my opinion. All right, next up we have Graves Vanguard Reroll. This comp is still, in my opinion, not fully solved in terms of the best econ strategy of how to play it. So I've seen some players roll on level 6. I've seen some players roll on level 7. I've seen mixed rolling where you roll on level 6 until 4-2 and then start rolling on level 7 after that point. I've seen all sorts of different options. In my opinion, we don't fully understand at this point exactly what we're looking for with this. I still think that this is moving towards the direction of becoming more like 3-cost reroll, similar to the transition from Camille to Smeech in set 13, but I don't know if we'll see that full transition in this particular set yet. So this is something where I'm waiting for more data, and I'm waiting for more high-level players to have more experience with this. What I will say so far, there's a couple of conditions that make this line pretty solid. So there's a lot of different artifacts that are good. Not Today is pretty good. Obviously, Living Forge is good. Freaky Friday is good. Pandora's Bench is really interesting because any composition that is a reroll composition that really wants to be able to hit a 5-cost at some point in the game, a specific 5-cost to finish their trait, like Executioner here, or Ambushers like last set, then you really find that you can get a lot of value out of Pandora's. And the big thing of note here is Double Trouble is quite good. There's a couple of different ways you can play this. This is currently looking to play around Double Graves, Double Rengar, and Double Varus, but you can also look to play around Double Vex if you're not able to 3-star this Varus, and that's mainly it for Executioner Reroll. Pretty straightforward comp. You're just playing Executioners plus Divinicorp units, and that's it. All right, next up we have Twisted Fate Reroll. This is a composition that got nerfed before the set went live. They nerfed 5 Syndicate damage amp from 20% down to 15%. The comp is still quite good, but it did definitely affect how strong the comp was. This is an item check composition, meaning that you really need to have double Rageblade ideally on Twisted Fate because of his passive, which gives him ability power on each auto attack. And then you want to pair that double Rageblade with something like Gunblade, or Zanya's is his best in slot artifact because when he's untargetable for those last 3 seconds of the fight, he's already scaled a bunch of auto attacks and has a ton of AP. You also have Gambler's Blade, which is quite good as a Rage Blade replacement. You can farm a ton of gold with this if you're able to get this in stage 2. You could pair your double Rage Blade with something like Luden's Tempest, Wit's End, Jeweled Gauntlet, or you can go the traditional scaling build, which is Rage Blade, Archangel, Gunblade. But in this case, we actually don't want to play the Archangel because of the passive, but it is an option if you're not able to hit that second Rage Blade. When it comes to Darius artifacts, you're looking for Silvermere Dawn, which might come as a surprise, but I saw this on PBE. It looked completely broken. The stats were good on PBE as well. I'm curious if the stats on live will agree with this, but it basically healed him to full every single time he would cast his ability, and he did a ton of damage. Innervating Locket is also quite good. And then the other really strong condition for this comp is Syndicate Emblem, because then you can drop out of the Shaco that we were playing before, and you get to play Aurora on your board, which gives Dynamo for your Misfortune, who is your secondary carry, and you get to throw in a high quality unit. So this is a massive massive spike for this particular comp. That's why it brings it up to S tier. And then there's also this augment too much value, which is quite good because you can play 4 2-costs relatively easily with Twisted Fate, Darius, Skarner, and then Rhaast, for example, would be a good 4th 2-cost that you could play and get a free 2 rerolls every single turn. So that's mainly it for how to play Twisted Fate reroll. It's still a relatively strong composition, but you do need to have good items for it to make it work. All right, next up we have Fiddlesticks Reroll. This is a very item-driven composition. If you have any special artifacts, radiance, or bruiser emblem, then this is a line that you want to consider. And there's a lot of different options for this. So we have Anima Visage on Cho'Gath that's good. We have Talisman of Ascension on Cho'Gath that's strong. We have Blighting Jewel and Sniper's Focus on Fiddlesticks. There's also a number of different Radiant items we can consider here. So Archangel Radiant, Rabadon's Radiant on Fiddlesticks. We also have Dragon's Claw Radiant and Warmog's Radiant on Cho'Gath. All of these bring the line up to S tier, as well as Bruiser Emblem on Fiddlesticks. So we have up to close to 10 different conditions, 10 different items that you can get that take this line from being one that you don't want to play to being S tier. So I would be very mindful of these different artifacts and radiant items as well as the Bruiser emblem, because even though this is not a line you're going to want to angle into just because you hit some Fiddlesticks or maybe some Bruisers early on, it is a line you're going to want to angle into if you get any of these special artifacts, radiance, or Bruiser emblem. And there's a lot of different conditions under which you can hit those, whether it's an encounter or a specific augment, that would make this composition quite strong. All right, next up we have Bruiser Aphelios, another Bruiser line, and this is taking advantage of the fact that Aphelios and Xayah are 4-cost with the same carry trait in Marksman, so you can play the 2 of them in the back line with 6 Bruisers in the front line. I would only angle towards this line if you have a Radiant or Artifact item for Cho'Gath, so that's mainly Talisman of Ascension, Anima Visage, Innervating Locket, Radiant Warmogs, or Radiant Declaw. If you have one of those different items, then you can consider playing into this line. Otherwise, generally speaking, it's better to play Aphelios plus Xayah into Vanguards rather than into Bruisers. All right, next up we have Techie Reroll. I've seen a lot of different opinions on how this should be played. I've seen some people say that you can play this as 1-cost reroll, where you're looking to 3-star Poppy, Seraphine, and Zyra, and play Seraphine plus Zyra as your backline carries, and Poppy as your tank in the front line. I've seen some people say that you should just push levels with it and look to play around Brand plus Viego in the late game. I think both of those lines are wrong. I think the way you're supposed to play Techie Reroll is you need to 3-star these 3 units right here, Seraphine, Shyvana, and Veigar. I think if you don't 3-star these 3 specific units, you're probably not going to do very well. In the late game, by the way, you can replace this Poppy for Koboko. The reason I think this is that if you just play around Seraphine plus Zyra, you just don't have enough damage to kill anything. So you really want to have this Veigar that can actually kill stuff for you, and then Seraphine usually gets the backline really weak to the point where Veigar can just one-shot everything once it gets to the backline, and sometimes Seraphine is able to just kind of snipe the backline for you. So I think Seraphine is very powerful. I think she's a better carry than Zyra, especially in the late game, and I think that this is the best way to play Techie Reroll. I'm not 100% on this, but what this does mean is that generally speaking, you should only play this line if you have a lot of copies of the 2-cost on 2-1 along with some of the 1-cost, or if you get something like a reroll augment such as Starry Night or Prismatic Ticket. I think unless those conditions are met, you generally should not be looking to angle into this line. The last thing I want to mention is that Mana Zane on Veigar is very powerful. I believe it's like extremely powerful, like close to -1 delta at the time of recording this. I doubt it'll stay that powerful, but it is worth noting that Mana Zane on Veigar is very good. All right, next up we have Shaco Reroll. This is a composition that's gotten nerfed so many times over the course of the PBE that it's not really a surprise that it's a little bit on the weaker side. They've nerfed Shaco's AD scaling, not the amount that he gets per kill, but the amount of damage that he does. They've nerfed his Kingpin bonuses, and just generally speaking have put him in a place where he's not going to be overly obnoxious on the launch patch. So generally speaking, I would aim to only play Shaco if you have a lot of copies of him in the early game, if you're able to get something like Not Today, or maybe one of these good artifacts or radiant items onto him, or maybe if you're able to get one of the emblems where you can drop out of one of the Slayer units and play Slayer Misfortune, or if you get Syndicate emblem, you might be able to play into Misfortune secondary carry in the backline, which would be quite good because you're dropping the Twisted Fate for Aurora. But overall, generally speaking, I would prefer to play towards some of the other lines rather than this one, unless you have a really strong spot for Shaco in particular. All right, next up, I want to talk about the different hero augments that are playable. I'm not going to talk about the quote-unquote unplayable hero augments because generally speaking, you should not be clicking those. If you want to see the comps for those, you can go over to the website and view those yourself. But the first one here that's playable is Adaptive Strikes Jax. This one's relatively straightforward. You're going to play 6 Bastion, which pairs best with Zeri. Generally speaking, would only click this if you have a lot of copies of Jax, have good items for him. So this is his best in slot build currently, which is Bloodthirster, QSS, and Titans. And if you have a good exotech item for Zeri, so that would be either Flux Capacitor or the Pulse Stabilizer. If you have one of those two as your first exotech item, then you can consider playing into this line. The next viable hero augment is Cease and Desist Vi, where you're effectively playing a modified version of Vayne Reroll. It's really not modified at all, except for the fact that you're preferring to play around 6 Vanguard because Vi is a frontline carry for you. And the big thing to note about this is that this Cease and Desist augment makes it so that Vi is very easily able to get into the back line and just randomly kill people's carries. So I've seen a couple of different positions for Vi where you can play her here on the edge, you can play her here where Rhaast is, and I think this will get optimized more over time to ensure that Vi is more likely to get onto the enemy corner carry. So just be on the lookout for that because I'm sure some people will release some tips for how to position Vi with this hero augment. And the final hero augment I want to talk about is Alter Ego Rhaast or Kayn. Now I think this is one that people were playing wrong at first, and I think people are starting to discover how to play it correctly. The big thing about this is that you need to get Rhaast to reset as often as possible. And the way you do so is number one, building Hodge plus IE. And then that third item previously always was an Omnivamp item with Bloodthirster or Hand of Justice. I think Hand of Justice is better, number one, just because you want more damage. But I also think you should consider just having a damage item as the third item because you really do want Kayn to reset as often as possible with his ability. This is also why Divinicorp is better than the Vanguard version, at least in my opinion, because in the Vanguard version, which is again modified Vayne Reroll, you're really just giving defenses to your Kayn, but you're not giving any offensive capability, whereas in the Divinicorp version, you're able to give him AD, you're able to give him crit, you're able to give him attack speed, and if you have the emblem, you're also able to give him Omnivamp, which is quite powerful. So generally speaking, I think the philosophy behind the Kayn hero augment is you want as much offensive capability as possible on Rhaast, while still giving him at least some Omnivamp with the Hodge plus IE combo, so that he can ideally one-shot as many units, reset as often as possible, and cycle through the entire enemy team. And if you can get to that point with something like a Radiant item, for example, Radiant IE is better than Radiant Hodge, for example, because of this, then this hero augment can actually be quite broken and move up to S tier. And that's it for the Set 14 launch guide. I hope this helped you all. This is one of the few times that we had the final patch at the very end of PBE. So we already had some data going into the launch of the set, and we knew quite a bit going in, and that really helped with being able to get this video out a little bit sooner. So I hope it's helpful for all of you, and I will see you next time.